So we have a lot to talk about tonight, and without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce the director of our new institute, David Steiner.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Marielle, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. We have a challenge before us, which Václav Havel once called living in the truth. It is a truth that is complicated. There are no simple answers, there are no simple truths to the enormous challenge of creating educational opportunity for every single child in Baltimore, in Maryland, and across the country. This is not a case of silver bullets. This is not a case of cliches. This is an extraordinarily long journey that this country has taken upon itself. 10 years ago, the phrase college and career readiness was almost unknown. For those with short memories, it's worth remembering that we keep moving the goalposts. What was once high school graduation as an ultimate destination, then became college for a few, then community college for a few more, and then finally college career for everybody. No country in the world has tried to measure itself against that standard, still less for peoples who come from every walk of life, every nation, every race, every language. That is a daunting democratic challenge. But we do no favors to any child by pretending to speak other than the truth about where they are, where we are as a society. And that's why we're here today, and that's why this institute exists. Not in the end because of smoke-filled rooms or gray corridors of power or secret conversations, but about each child in each classroom, in each school. This institute will do what it can to bring you, the crucial people, the educators, the teachers, the principals, the policymakers together around honest and difficult conversations with only one goal: to help raise the opportunities, open doors for our children. We start today with assessments simply because they are with us, they are new, and they offer, if you will, a thermometer, a temperature reading of where we start with this new enterprise of ensuring that every child has that opportunity for college and for careers, and knowing that this is the beginning of a journey. We are not here to scold, we're not here to point fingers. We all have responsibilities, every single one of us. That's why we're here. And we hope that in these conversations tonight and many to come that the Institute will create, will support, you will find in this space a place where you can bring your ideas, your concerns, your thoughts. We are open to your ideas about what we should be discussing, with whom, how to be ever more inclusive. And we hope to hear from you after tonight about how we can be a value add in this community and in this state. Let me say at once that while these results that we'll be discussing tonight are sobering, we share them with so many communities across the country. You will hear that these results are particularly daunting for certain groups of our population, but that is not new. What is new is the language in which we're speaking about them and the aspirations that we hold for those students. We have with us tonight 3 guests who represent different ways of thinking about these deep programs and problems. Laura Slover has been leading one of the 2 great national coalitions, thinking about assessments and diagnostics that give real information to teachers and parents and students about where they are and where they might be, information that can be used to improve the opportunities of children. Andy Smarick, an old friend who's been in many walks of life in education, now puts his energies to work as a member of the Maryland State School Board. And what can one say about Dr. Sauls, but that She's been here at the foundation of this conversation in Baltimore. She has led the conversation in Baltimore. She knows this community, these schools, these teachers, principals, students, in a way that few do. We are honored by her presence tonight. I'm going to ask that Laura begins by giving us a sense of what these new assessments are, where we stand. Then I'm going to ask Andy to say something about NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, often called the gold standard, because it is, as it were, outside of any individual state and has tracked America's school children for many, many years. And then invite us to comment, the two of us, to reflect, and to bring everybody together around a conversation. So without more ado, Laura, will you say something about PARCC? Thank you.
Okay. How is everyone tonight?
Good.
Good. Great. I want to thank you, Dean Steiner, for having this event this evening. It's a great opportunity to have hopefully an open, honest discussion, and I'd like to make a few remarks to begin to tell you a little bit who I am and what PARCC is about, but I don't want to talk too long because I want to get to conversation, and we also have two other esteemed colleagues here to give a few remarks too. So my name's Laura Slover, and I think my most important job is as a mother. I'm the mother of a second grader who attends a DC public school, and I say that because DC is a member, a compadre in the PARCC Consortium. And I think about, as we do this work, the kind of assessment that I want my daughter to experience, because tests are a part of life, and so I want them to be really good, so she has a good experience. I'm also a former teacher. I started my career in Colorado in the public schools in Eagle County. I'm joined here by two colleagues who have a deep history here with the Johns Hopkins University. Callie Riley served on the Teaching and Learning Advisory Council for JHU School of Education, and Emily Alvarez, who also grew up in Maryland and received her Master of Arts in Teaching here as well and went on to teach at her alma mater. I think I've already mentioned that to a couple of you, just next door in Anne Arundel County. So you've got some locals here, and we're also in the neighborhood, so we'd love to spend a lot more time with you. So when I think about why I got into education, it was really because of what David said, that every child deserves, no matter where they live, what their parents do for a living, an opportunity in life and an equal opportunity to achieve. And that's what drives us. Most of my team is also made up of former teachers, because we believe that higher standards and aligned assessment as part of a comprehensive system will help us raise the bar and put all kids on a path to success. That is something that we truly believe. Now, we, PARCC Inc., work for you. We work for the state of Maryland, and we work for the other collaborative partner states in the PARCC Consortium, which was founded in 2010 with the goal of providing a quality education for every student in every school. The leaders in the PARCC Consortium believe that every school can be excellent and every kid can get a great education, but we're also reminded often of the facts in this country, that 28 to 40% of first-time undergraduates enroll in at least one remedial course, at least one. These students are, of course, highly unlikely to complete. I'm probably telling you data that of which you are aware. They're unlikely to complete a degree or certificate on time, and many will not complete a degree at all. So what happens in K-12 matters for the future of these kids. Black and Hispanic kids are much more likely than white kids to fall behind in school and to drop out, and less likely to graduate from high school, certainly less likely to acquire a college or advanced degree, or to earn a middle-class living. So the decisions and the outcomes of high school have long-lasting effects. More than half of employers have an open job for which they cannot find qualified candidates, and 8 in 10 employers have difficulty hiring anyone at all to fill a position who's qualified. So raising standards and measuring student achievement matters. It matters very much, and it's critical to solving the challenge of preparing our kids for success in college and careers. Even though the results that you'll hear about tonight are sobering, we are making progress, and I think we come to this work optimistic. When the states came together in 2010, the PARCC states, the Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, they made a decision to really raise the bar, to set high goals and expect kids to reach those goals, to measure performance using a high-quality assessment, and to use the same bar to measure college and career readiness. There's been a lot of conversation about whether career readiness and college readiness are the same. And the fact of the matter is you're not going to do the same thing in every job that you do in every career and that you do in every course in college. That's a fact. But the level of preparation to give kids a foundation and to provide them open doors and opportunities is the same. And so as we think about setting kids on a path, we think about making sure that they have the foundational skills and knowledge they need so that they are ready wherever they decide to go. The assessment system was designed to assess learning and support instruction during the school year. Later, I'll tell you about some of those components. Certainly, PARCC is an end-of-year assessment, and that's probably what you're most familiar with. But there are also these other tools and components that can help learning during the year, and I think they're very important to me as an educator. PARCC states needed to report growth in performance as well as absolute achievement, so we could be looking at kids who are making progress even if they're not quite meeting the bar. And very importantly, the states wanted to be able to compare results within states, but also across states, so that there could be a common language and a common understanding of performance so that they could push one another and learn from another. And of course, to generate valid and reliable information. Many of you know that the PARCC assessments are also being offered online, and that was one of the goals of the consortium states at the beginning, was to really raise the bar and turn to the 21st century, where many students are using technology, and we wanted the assessments to reflect that. So, fast forward 5 years, we've done 5 years of assessment development, we've launched the work, kids have taken the assessment in 12 states, and now it's about time to report results. Well, we need to know what we're reporting results against. What are the expectations of the program? And so PARCC determined that it would have 5 performance levels. Many states used 3, many used 4, a few were already using 5, but the states together decided that they would use 5 levels. So you'll see when results come out, and they have started to come out in Maryland and a few other states, they'll be reported out against these 5 levels. Now why? Why 5? Because we wanted to have enough information about all students along the continuum so that you'd have enough rich information about students who are at the lower end and, equally importantly, at the higher end. In many previous iterations of state assessments, there was a lot of data maybe around the middle, so you'd know whether a kid was proficient or not, but less information about the kids at what we call the tails. So the program really is designed to take a good look at kids' performance. What do they know? What can they do? Regardless of whether they're high achievers or low achievers or in the middle. The process that we used to set the performance levels was really an educator-driven process. We had hundreds of educators from Maryland and other states come together in Denver over a series of many weeks to look at how kids did on each item and what performance level they would fall into if they answered certain questions a certain way. And so they went item by item by item, looked at the items as a whole, and then tried to characterize what performance at each of one of those levels looked like. It's a very robust process. I don't want to go too much into it, although I'm happy to answer questions later, but really shows the level of educator engagement in the work. And then as you'll see, levels 4 and 5 were the levels that were really meant to designate which kids were ready to go on to the next grade or ready to enter directly into credit-bearing courses when they got to a post-secondary institution. It's a little more about the process. So in September, when those performance levels were set, then we went about the business of calculating the scores, and now states have begun to release those scores. Just as a brief reminder, 12 states took the assessment last year. 1.2 million students took it on a single day and took it on the computer. There was a lot of concern about whether the computer and the technology-based platform would work. Well, I'll tell you, it really did. 75% of students took the test online. We had anticipated about 50%. 80% of students in Maryland took the assessments online. So Maryland is ahead of the curve in many ways, including in terms of getting kids online. The platform performed well, 1 million test takers in a day over 5 days, and really, again, a testament to the Maryland educators who helped prepare schools and prepare their students to have a good experience. So this is a small slide, so I'm not going to expect you to read it, nor am I going to read it to you. This is a sample of the parent and family score reports. So I'm fast forwarding to now, because you will soon be receiving, for those of you who work in buildings, you'll be soon receiving in your buildings the parent and family score reports, which will be ready to go out to parents. You will have received your district level data, the state level data has been released already, and the next step is to get information in the hands of parents. Scores are now being released by states, and as they release, it's important to keep a few things in mind. And I just want to acknowledge that Doug Strader is here from the Maryland State Department of Education, and he's really been the lead in Maryland. So if any tough questions come my way, he'll answer them. But it's important also to know that it's hard to talk right now about the scores and compare Maryland to every other state, because Maryland's ahead of where other states are in terms of releasing its data, both at the highest level and then at the disaggregated level. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then of course defer to Doug if he wants to go further. But it is at this point challenging to compare, although by the end of the fall we'll have much more robust information, and you'll be able to compare whether you're in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Montgomery County, to other districts, Albuquerque, Boston, Chicago, to know how you did versus like districts, and dig into some of the data there and what can be learned from it. So I think there are a few things I want to just say as we think about the scores that are important to keep in mind. First of all, the test looks quite different from tests of the past. The states in PARCC decided that they really wanted to place a premium on having kids demonstrate understanding through reading and writing about what they read, actually through extended prompts and extended writing where they would read two pieces, for example, compare, contrast, synthesize, and make a claim. To do real analysis in mathematics and justification and explain their work. So there's a lot of open-ended items on the tests that require a lot of analytical and critical thinking. Scores may look a little lower. And in fact, I think one of the things we've seen nationally across the PARCC states is that states are looking at their scores, and they are looking a little bit lower than they did on the legacy tests. And there's one reaction is to panic and say, oh my goodness, our kids are not doing as well and something must be wrong. But the fact of the matter is the tests measure different skills, and the tests set a new baseline against a new set of standards, the standards that Maryland adopted 5 years ago. So the first year is a set of baseline scores, and this is the time when you get to start looking at progress. And starting from now, what does progress look like? To help parents understand the score, we've created a really cool website. It's called Understand the Score. How many people have gotten to take a look at it? Good. We'd love your feedback, by the way. If there are things that you think we could be doing better, let us know. This is all about engaging parents because we think there's going to be a lot of new information. They might be a little concerned, particularly when they get their score report back, and remember those 5 levels. If they don't see their kid at level 4 or 5, they'll wonder what's going on, and they'll wonder how to help their child. And this website is designed to be a one-stop shop in terms of explaining the detailed score report. What does this mean? What do the sub-scores mean? And then what do I do about it? How can I help my child? How can I talk to my teacher? So I encourage you to go in and take a look at that. Very soon, score reports will be sent home. When are they going to schools? In the next couple weeks. Yeah. So this is going to start to get a lot of traffic, and we want to provide information to let you know how to get there. Let me just talk a little bit about the data. I didn't put a slide on here because it's really Maryland's data, and Maryland, I didn't want to come in here and share data that really is the State Department's to share. But you all have seen the high-level data. So I want to just highlight for you where Maryland is against a couple other states that have released data. So Maryland right now, and we've just seen the high school data. The 3 to 8 data is coming later. The Maryland data in terms of those students who have reached level 4 and 5, so they're considered ready for the next grade level or ready to move into college and careers, is in Algebra 1, let's focus on math first. In Algebra 1, Maryland's at a 31% ready level in Algebra 1. Now, that could sound good or bad depending on where you sit. And I understand that in 2007, when Maryland started on the path of MSAs, the results looked similar. and then you built from there. So anytime you have a new program, you set a new baseline. How does that compare to other states? Of the other states that have already reported, New Jersey is reporting about a 36% college and career readiness level, and New Mexico a 17%. Massachusetts right there in the middle with about 22%. So there's variation you'll see, and Maryland is not surprisingly doing better than many other states, but you'll see it's a good baseline with a lot of room for growth. In English language arts, looks a little bit different. 39% at the scoring at the 4 and the 5 level. So more kids at that ready bar in English 10, I wouldn't say English 9. In New Jersey, it's about 37%. In New Mexico, it's about 31%. Massachusetts didn't take that test, so I can't report out on that. But so you'll see the variation, and as the results continue to come out, I think you'll see that Maryland is at the higher end in terms of its relative scores compared to other states, but that there's still a lot of work to do. So I want to take a step back, or forward, I suppose, and say, what else is there? PARCC is an end-of-year test, and the states have worked very hard to develop what we think is the highest quality summative program in the country. It's also very transparent. The PARCC states have just released over 850 items of full test form in every grade in each subject. That's another great tool for the educators in this room, a really good communication tool with parents, where you can actually show them, well, your kid may not be scoring very high, they may be at a level 2, but look at the kinds of items. Here are the expectations. Let's work on these expectations with your child. There are other elements here. K2, formative tasks, speaking and listening, practice tests, and diagnostic tools. All of these make up a comprehensive system and really serve as an educational GPS system and provide a lot of instructional tools and supports for teachers. And we hope that they will have great take-up. They're being flooded into the field this fall, and we're ready to work with districts and schools and taking those up. And my dynamic duo team is here to help make that happen. So if you're interested in participating, particularly in these diagnostic tests, which are available at no cost to you this year, and can help you in your classrooms and help get information not just at the end of the year, but all the way throughout the year, we'd love to work with you on that. There are other tools for teachers, Partnership Resource Center, where a lot of the things I mentioned before are housed, including the released items. So that just gives you a little flavor, and I hope we can have more discussion as we move forward. Maryland has been an incredible partner. I want to just give kudos to Doug and to the folks at the Department of Ed and to all the educators, the nearly 1,000 educators from across the state that were involved in this work. It's been a very transparent process and a really exciting process to get teachers behind building of the assessments and the tools that they're going to use in their own classrooms. Thank you.
I'm Andy Smarick. I'm a member of the Maryland State Board. I'll begin by vamping a little bit just by saying I feel like I'm pulled in two different directions on this subject. On the one hand, I'm a product of Maryland Public Schools, from first grade at Broadneck Elementary all the way through college and then graduate school. I also have a little dude named Will who's 5 years old, who is in his first year kindergarten at our local elementary school. Right across the street from him is a preschool that has my 3-year-old twins, Maisie and Eddie, who are going to go into this elementary school as well. I also worked for the state legislature here in Maryland. I also worked for a congressman who represented Maryland. So I have skin in the game when it comes to Maryland public schools. I give that as a long introduction because of what I'm about to show you here. As a member of the State Board of Education, I also feel this need not just to be a cheerleader, not just to be an advocate, which I want to do at all times, but also to be a critical friend, be a person who has a level of independence to say the tough stuff that needs to be said when it needs to be said. And as my colleague on the board, Checker Finn, State Board, when he saw the PARCC results for the first time, the first words out of his mouth in public session were something along the lines of, this is a cold shower. And I think it's true. The data that we saw, let's just say it wasn't totally encouraging. There were some discouraging things about it. And so NAEP was, without belaboring sort of an analogy here, if that was the cold shower, this is almost like the ice bucket challenge. And I'm going to show you, I mean, there's some discouraging things here. So with this long introduction, I hope you know I care deeply about this system. I am here to try to make it better, but I think part of making it better is having a very frank conversation about what many of us thought for a long time, #1 in the nation. So let me begin, actually, before going there. I'm going to talk about NAEP, the National Assessment for Education Progress. Some people call it the nation's report card. It goes back decades and decades and decades. Led by the National Assessments Governing Board. It's a federal entity. The gist here is they have civics and geography tests, a whole bunch of different things that they administer. Under NCLB, for the first time in 2002, they required all states to participate in this test, particularly the 4 tests that we're going to talk about here, or I'm going to talk about. Reading and math, 4th grade, 8th grade. 4th grade reading, 4th grade math, 8th grade reading, 8th grade math. It is every 2 years, and we get the data back from it. It is a sample of the state. It is not every single student taking it. And it is a big enough sample that we can disaggregate at a statewide level. So we can have a conversation about low-income kids, ELL kids, African American, Latino. What we can't do is talk about Howard County, talk about Montgomery County, talk about Queen Anne's County with NAEP results, with one exception, which is TUDA. Typical federal, really bad acronym here. Trial Urban District Assessment. So NAEP is a statewide assessment. The data I'm going to show you, very simple, just going to show you scale scores for all 50 states and Washington, D.C., so 51. 12 years ago, the federal government, with the help of an organization called the Council of Great City Schools, decided it would be very helpful if we had NAEP data, the National Assessment for Education and Progress, state-level stuff, but down at the district level for our biggest and, in many of our eyes, most troubled big urban school districts. So about 12 districts 12 years ago decided to step up, and they did essentially an oversampling of NAEP in these 12 districts. New York City, Boston, Chicago, so forth. So we could look at how all of our states were doing and then look at our low-income big urban districts. Over the past 12 years, 1 or 2 districts have dropped out of it, Milwaukee most recently, and several districts have joined in, including Baltimore 5, 6, 7 years ago. So we have data on Baltimore as well. So this long introduction is to tell you, I'm going to show you how Maryland stacks up in the 4 tests that we're going to talk about, and then I'm going to show you how Baltimore stacks up with their big urban district peers. Good orientation? Hopefully it suffices, if not good. Okay, so this is 4th grade math. This is what we call the all students score. The y-axis matters a whole lot less when it comes to what it actually is. It's a scale score. It's not proficiency. It's not basic. It's just how these things are scored. So don't care as much about the number, at least for our purposes here. It's about the x-axis. And all I did was straight, simple, ordered them. Rank order, highest to lowest. As you can see, Maryland is middle of the pack, 4th grade math scores. Actually a little lower, middle of the pack. If any of you know education data, the first thing on your mind probably is, well, aggregate figures can tell us anything. That's why we have NCLB. That's why we had MISPAP. We need to disaggregate data. We need to know how subgroups are doing. Vermont, their population looks a whole lot different than Mississippi. Is this really fair? Fair point. So I could disaggregate this 1,000 different ways. We don't have 2 weeks, so what I decided for each of these grades is what I'm simply going to do for each of the tests is break it down into one disaggregation. Low-income kids and higher-income kids. Low-income kids, what we call in the business FRLP, free and reduced price lunch kids. So it's generally kids who are their families above the poverty line. And their more affluent peers are the kids who are not eligible. So what I'm about to show you now is a comparison of Maryland's low-income kids compared to the low-income kids in all other states in 4th grade math. So, our low-income kids are among the lowest performing low-income kids in the nation in 4th grade math. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's just one subject out of 4. This is how our non-poor students are doing, our wealthier kids. So we're talking about, I'm not saying all of these kids they're in families that are making $1 million a year, so they are by no means all super affluent, but they just don't qualify for free and reduced price lunch. So this is how our non-poor students stack up against non-poor students in all other states. middle of the pack-ish. Okay, that's one of 4 tests. So this is 4th grade reading. Maryland, again, middle of the pack compared to all other states. Let's disaggregate. How do our poor kids do compared to poor kids in other states? Again, we're in the bottom third. Our higher income kids are just at the top of the middle third. And this is in 4th grade. And I feel the need to say this, I'm not putting this on any of you, but it's the thing on the table. When I saw this data for the first time, I was wondering how we allowed ourselves to talk about number 1 in the nation, number 1 in the nation, number 1 in the nation for so long. There was even some talk when we applied for Race to the Top at the beginning of this previous administration that maybe we shouldn't, because it's, why do you need to race to the top when you're already at the top? That's the narrative that as a state board member I'm grappling with. Okay, so let's move on to 8th grade. 8th grade math. I assume you're starting to see the pattern here. Maryland, all students, middle of the pack, dead center on this one. Our low-income kids in 8th grade math are among the lowest performing in the nation. And we are just barely at the top part of the middle third when it comes to our higher income kids. Now, if there's any good news on this, it's 8th grade reading. We are at the bottom of the top third of states at all student level. Our low-income kids are at the bottom of the middle third, and our higher income kids are doing marginally better here. We're about 10th in the nation. So this is where we stand. This is an assessment that's going on for quite some time. If you would like, we can talk about the accommodations, the exclusions, the Common Core alignment, all that stuff. But hopefully you understand why some of us were referring to this as a cold shower. This is hard to get psyched and say we're hitting home runs when that's what we've been told for quite some time. Okay, that was the good news. Now I want to talk to you about Baltimore and NAEP TUTA. Again, Trial Urban District Assessment. These are currently about 20 big urban school districts. They're the ones that you know most about: New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. There are also some in here that may not immediately trigger recognition to you because they are big counties in Florida that happen to have a big city in them. Miami-Dade, for example, but Duval, for example. In general, these are some of the biggest urban districts in America that participate in this, and Baltimore is one of them. So I put quotes around progress. You'll see why. So this is the average of the big cities that participate in the test going back to the first administration in 2003. You'll see there is a reading and a math line, even though they're virtually coterminous. And here, actually, the y-axis does matter because this isn't just scale scores, this is proficiency. This is the assessment of NAGB, the federal government, of whether or not these students are on grade level, prepared to move on. What we're seeing, and I just aggregated here by African American students, you would see virtually the same thing if we were talking about low income kids, but I wanted to make sure you saw that I wasn't playing games with the numbers by just using free and reduced price lunch. What you see here is virtually no progress on average over 12 years. That's 4th grade African American kids, and this is 8th grade African American kids, again, proficiency. So what I'm doing is trying to set the context for you, that the districts that have participated in this historically are part of a uniform universe of persistently underperforming districts. This will become important in a moment. I want you to see that it is not as though there is wide variation in the performance of these districts. It's not like some are hitting home runs and some are very, very low performing. There is some variation. What you're seeing here again is 8th grade African Americans proficiency levels and reading and math scores, which are about the same for each of the districts. All of them are up there, all the ones that participated in this administration. I just put a circle around Baltimore just to orient you. Some are marginally better than the other, but we're talking about, as I like to say, I mean, not to put too fine a point on this, not a single big urban school district in America, according to this assessment, is able, after decades of efforts to improve them, are able to get even 1 in 5 of their African American kids up to proficiency in these subjects that we care so much about. as they're heading into high school, and that is across the board. So that's the orientation about the universe of school systems we're talking about. I wanted to point out to you that Baltimore is not in a great state right now. 8th grade reading, some people argue, is the most important of the 4 tests because it's both an indication of the system itself, given that many of the kids have been in that system for 9 years, kindergarten through 8th grade, so there should be some residue of the system within these scores. And it's also a pretty good predictor of whether or not students are going to be able to succeed in high school, whether or not you can read proficiently by the time you're ending 8th grade. These are the districts that have made the least amount of progress in 8th grade reading over this period of time. Washington, D.C., and I believe it was Cleveland are the ones that participated in the first administration. The rest of them began participating, I think, in the 08-09 administration. But you see virtually flatlined, and Baltimore is one of these 5 districts that in this highly important test isn't making progress with this very important group of students. Okay, so what I want to show you now is where Baltimore stacks up in these 4 tests that I showed you earlier among the 21 districts that participate in this assessment. Again, proficiency rates, same disaggregation for same tests. Among the lowest performing school districts in America, Baltimore is the next to the lowest performing school district in 4th grade reading among low-income kids. Only outperforming, I believe this is Detroit. Okay. This is 4th grade math. Again, FRPL, this is free and reduced price lunch eligible, so low-income kids. Among the lowest performing school districts in America, Baltimore is among the lowest performing. And the same thing virtually in 8th grade. We pass Fresno and Washington, D.C. in some of these. Sobering stuff, for sure. But thank goodness that this great institute is having us here to talk about this and to work on it. What I'll leave you with is, as a member of a state board of education, and maybe this is just cathartic, like how I have to deal with this, but this is a problem in Baltimore that's been going on for quite some time, and I and my colleagues on the board, I'll speak for myself, we don't have any illusions that we can solve this overnight, or that we have the right to serve it overnight. This reflects a whole lot of things, not just schools. It's poverty, and it's history, and it's lots of bad things that have happened to the city over a very long period of time. So this is not just about schools. And there are lots of 39-year-old white guys who have told cities for a long time that they're going to solve their problems and not solve them. So I bring a lot of humility into this, saying that this is something we got to deal with, but we have to deal with it. And that's the other side of it. We cannot allow this to keep on going, right? Among the lowest performing of the lowest performing. So this is a big challenge for us. Last thing I'll say is in my previous job was in New Jersey, and we dealt with Newark. Where there was a riot in the late 1960s, and they swore after the riot that they were going to make things much, much better for their schools in the late 1960s. And Newark, New Jersey is still among the lowest performing school districts around today, 40 plus years after a terrible crime and riots afterward. The point I'm getting at here is we don't have time to sort of sit on our hands. I don't want to be 40 years down the road and still looking at this data and saying, my goodness, I wish we had done something. So somehow, in this conversation, what I hope we can get to is that serious stuff, we can't solve everything, but my goodness, we cannot allow this to go on any longer. Thanks, folks.
Shanaysha, why don't you start with some reflections on what we heard?
Oh, yeah. So I have several, but I'm going to try to keep them short so that we can dig into a conversation, because I think being honest and frank and figuring out what those next steps are going to be, what's going to be most useful to everyone in the audience. So just by way of some context, I now operate a charter school in Baltimore City. Before my beginning, my tenure at that charter school, as of July 1, I served as the chair of the school board. here in Baltimore, and I also served as on the executive committee of the Council of Great City Schools. And so I appreciated Andy's sort of providing the history and the context of NAEP as the nation's report card, and how we are really using the TUDA to drive, not only to compare apples to apples in terms of how our major school districts are doing in urban areas, but also to drive the conversation about how we move our students and their families forward. So in Baltimore, unlike I think some places around the country, we went, for lack of a better term, whole hog into PARCC. We understood, and I think that we did it almost in an unabashed way, that this was going to provide an opportunity to give a good, hard look at how we are doing as a district. I think that the MSA served its purpose, but what we realized is that by engaging in the PARCC assessment and sort of embracing the Common Core, this would provide us with the necessary information so that we would know along the area, in the areas of Algebra 2, and ELA, what it is that we needed to do. And so we began transitioning the district into the Common Core, I guess, I want to say 3 years ago. Our challenge, and we can dig down into this much more, is that there has not been, and there probably is not anywhere consistently in the country, consistent academic leadership in the school district for lots of reasons. And this is not a finger-pointing exercise, but if we look at just the last 6 years alone, where we've really engaged in hard reform work, that reform work has been around largely restructuring, rethinking, in some respects, some limited respects, our financial model, sort of engineering some structural changes in the kinds of power or autonomies that we allocate to the school level. It did not come with it for any consistent period of time, sort of an academic reform model. And so I think that has been sort of a challenge of our work. I think one of the things that we tried to shift very quickly is to shift the locus of knowledge and responsibility from it being held all centrally and focusing it more on students than the schools. And again, all this was an organizational change. It was not a change in instructional vision of how we drive the system forward. And so we realized, and I realized very well, that the data show that we have some real challenges that we're going to need to confront. Now that I sit in the role as a practitioner instead of a policymaker, I think it's going to be very important for us to understand what happens when a student enters our school system in kindergarten. And if I may brag just a bit, when we release those results of the kindergarten readiness, we actually outperform the state in terms of our kindergartners being ready. So 48% of our kindergartners in Baltimore City were ready for kindergarten. That battery gives sort of it tests sort of 4 areas. And one of the areas is math. And I'm going to talk a lot about math at every opportunity that I get when I share my comments. But in math, we even outpaced the rest of the state. So we were something at 41, 42%. So what I'm trying to figure out, we might have something right in kindergarten. We are not starting behind the 8 ball. There have been investments that we've made early on that seem to pay off. What the conversation needs to be is what happens between kindergarten and 3rd and 4th grade, that now we're in a situation where our students are behind the 8 ball. So we're not starting from a deficit. And so as we think about the conversation, I don't want us to think about this in terms of starting from a deficit, because when we get them in kindergarten, we are actually outperforming our peers in other counties across the state and making sure our students are ready. Where we are failing them is what happens in the subsequent years.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Let me just make a few empirical remarks and then get back to the discussion. Laura, of course, rightly careful about getting into other states' results, and I won't either, except to say, because this is public data, that if you look at the DC, Washington, DC, English 10th grade results, which are the most relevant and comparable with Baltimore, the numbers are so close as to be indistinguishable. We're talking about fractions of percentages. Those fractions of percentages are equally sobering. For those of you who haven't seen the results in Algebra 1 for Baltimore City, we're speaking of 7.1% of African Americans who are college and career ready in Baltimore City. Free and reduced meals, 6.8% are college and career ready. If we look at white students, we're at 31%. So white students are approximately 4 times more likely to be ready for the next level of education as are minority students. That's the truth we're grappling with in this city today. And to say that we have the company of Washington, D.C. is not to give us any comfort at all. It's to say that as a nation, we failed to solve this problem. I think the bottom line then is that we are, as a nation, achieving modestly by international standards. Those 30 to 40% readiness for white students is nothing to be proud of. But these tragic achievement gaps are still more sobering. And they are, of course, part of why we're here today. I guess my first question to everybody is, looking at these kind of results, is your instinct that the solutions are in multiple, carefully thought out programs? That is, a better reading program here, better professional development here, a more thorough thinking about after-school programs there, a project here? Or are we looking at the vital need for some kind of much deeper structural change? And I know those are perhaps artificial extremes, two ends of a spectrum, but faced with this kind of result, you can understand that for many, the sense of incrementalism is, we'll all be dead, right, by the time this happens. How do you react to, Andy, do you want to start?
Well, so I'll speak now as a guy who writes and reads about this stuff as opposed to like a state board member, because I don't want to commit the administration or any of my colleagues to any of this. What I'll say is this. I think we have two different types of problems. Our, let's say, non-Baltimore, maybe non-PG County, but at least for the purposes here, non-Baltimore districts in Maryland. I think there are lots of good things happening, and I think from a state policy point of view, we could do a lot of things better over the next, call it, decade. A new accountability system, rethink what we've done with teacher evaluation, a whole host of things. Like, I would put the need to rethink that stuff like on a 6 or 7 on a 10-point scale. I would put the need to do something dramatic in Baltimore at a 10. This is the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night. I don't have faith that we are going to see dramatically different results in Baltimore City without dramatically different policies. And we can have a conversation about what those look like, but the places that I'm most excited in across the nation that have made the biggest gains are the ones that it required a state intervention, and not the traditional type where the mayor takes over or you get rid of the superintendent and the board. I'm talking about an independent public charter school sector, not authorized by the district. The New Orleans or the essentially Memphis model of using a recovery or achievement school district, opening up public education, a new sector within the sphere for nonprofit organizations to do much more. I don't believe that if we continue to do the same things with the district that we've done, that things are going to be 2, 3, 5 times better in a decade. We need to do big things different in Baltimore.
Yeah, so this is a good conversation. And I don't want to throw around too much lingo, so I apologize. So as a district, school district, we sort of branded ourselves, and I think we substantiated our reforms in terms of being a portfolio district. Our portfolio model was essentially that we had different kinds of schools, some operated by the school district, some operated by nonprofit partners, including charter schools, but all under the aegis of the school district. And I say that term tongue-in-cheek. I have kind of a sense of humor. No one else does. That's okay. I didn't drink tonight. I thought you did. All right. So at any rate, and so it turned out that my dogged commitment to this notion of the portfolio district, in which there was a single sort of authorizer, might have been a unicorn. I mean, frankly, I believe in the notion of the portfolio district, but what it requires in order for it not to be a unicorn is a district that is really willing to be self-reflective and to be disciplined and to be honest about what it can and cannot do. And I don't think that the incentives are in place for the district to do that, A. And B, I think there are so many assumptions built into how we do business, whether it's through contracts, collective bargaining agreements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that it becomes really difficult for the thing to be as innovative as it could be. And so to your point about a restructuring, I think what I've learned is that it is ridiculous for me to assume that someone can, with absolute power, can constrain themselves or itself, and we will have to look for a different solution.
You're part of conversations across the country. What are you hearing in reaction to these kind of results?
Well, I think, this is a very interesting conversation about district level policy. When I go around the country, I was actually in New Orleans last week and got to go into a classroom, and it was a charter school, bricolage, great spot. Diversity by design. A real intentional focus on kids of different family backgrounds and different colors all together to have great learning experiences. And what you see in the classroom, if you come way down a level, is what matters the most. And I think we have to have a dramatically different way of preparing our teachers and supporting our teachers to make sure that they're providing what kids need. And I might have looked at the DC results, and the results that you showed, where the lowest performing on the free and reduced price lunch, DC was the lowest.
Correct.
On the affluent, highest.
Highest.
That is two completely different experiences in one city, and it's all about what happens in the classroom and making sure that all of our teachers have what they need.
So let me just push back for a second, because as a former commissioner, I know only too well, of course, the politics around charter schools, the politics around so much of the structural reform. There is an alternative vision which says it's about curriculum and it's about teachers, right? That we underteach compared to many other countries, that we are skills fanatics, but we won't teach rich content. So few high school students who could benefit from AP or International Baccalaureate actually have the opportunity to do so. When they're given that opportunity, they rise to it, as do their teachers. And then the teachers, and I speak now as a former dean of a big school of education in New York, we do a very bad job of preparing our teachers for the real classrooms. We don't give them enough clinical experience. I imagine the reaction is it's both and, not either or. In other words, we may have to look at a structural reform, but my instinct, and I'm testing it with the three of you, is that unless we address what we teach, right, and the quality through which we teach it, we can do as much structural fun and games as we can politically, and we may not deliver.
So, I am inclined to agree with you in part. So here's where I agree with you. I agree with you that we need to really think about curriculum and pedagogy, and that is not my area, so I'm going to freely talk about it. So I would say that in Baltimore, at least in English language and arts, or English and language arts, and maybe math, I don't know, but much more in ELA, we made, I think, the right investments in curriculum. The problem was how it was delivered and executed for the people who actually had to teach it. I am actually not convinced that our ELA curriculum is wrong. I think that the people who were on the ship, who brought in that curriculum, knew exactly what they were doing, but it takes time, and it takes energy, and it takes focus, and it takes quality control to make sure that your teachers know how to deliver it. And there's really no accountability for how the curriculum is delivered. Now, in terms of the math curriculum, there's a big question mark. I just don't know, because we started late, and I'm not sure that the math curriculum was driven as I think it should be, as someone who does not have a background, so I'm going to speak freely about it, to make sure that students are ready for algebra as the baseline upper level math. But I just don't know.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, give me 60 seconds to talk about this subject that we both alluded to, because I think it's inside the weeds, but the policy here is really important. And it is the difference between an independent charter sector and what some people call as a portfolio district, which we have here in Baltimore. In 1990-91, when Minnesota passed their first charter law, you can think about that as like public education delivery 2.0. We had always delivered public education through a district, a uniform government provider. It ran, owned, operated all schools. The first charter law, and then through 1995, the states that adopted charter laws did the same thing that Minnesota did, which is that the district is still in charge, but the district is going to run some schools, but then oversee some nonprofits that run some other schools. So it functions both as an operator and as an authorizer. Now, that is the model that was perpetuated in Baltimore, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, and in Denver. It is the district is still the monolith. It is in charge of all public schools. Whether it runs them or oversees them is separate. Something happened in 1995-96 in Michigan and Massachusetts, and then later in Indiana, in Washington, D.C., in Louisiana, where they said that public education is a space. The district is part of that space, but there can be a sector within public education that is not beholden to the district. So we're going to create these things called non-district authorizers, bodies, state blessed, that can approve nonprofits to run schools. And so what we see now are the places where there are uniformly the highest performing charter sectors in America. Boston, where kids are learning a year more in reading and math per year. Washington, D.C., where they're learning 100 days more in reading per math per year. In Indianapolis, in New Orleans, and in Newark, where they're learning almost a year more per year in reading and math. All of those places have one thing in common: a single non-district charter authorizer. They went to chartering 3.0, not doing the portfolio thing. They created a separate space. The question for Maryland, the question for Baltimore is, are we going to continue in the 2.0 model or do this separate space where you get free of the collective bargaining agreement of the old practices of the district? We've decided not to do that yet, but we have going on 20 years of experience elsewhere saying it's successful.
But Andy, let me push back quickly.
Please.
On the very results you showed, and we could have disaggregated the Washington results, DC results, between the charter school and non-charter school.
No, you can't. This is a very important
Not for
point.
NAEP, but you can for PARCC.
For PARCC, yes, but not for the two results that I showed.
But for PARCC you can.
That's right.
And I've seen those, right? And there's, let me just say very carefully, remarkably less difference than you might expect. There's no question that these cities you've mentioned have made enormous progress, if by that you mean they've gone from an F to a D+, which is a huge difference. I'm not for a moment, I mean, it makes a life difference.
Yes.
But none of them have gotten those students to a C. I mean, you said it yourself, there isn't a single urban district in this country that at scale has reached a C.
Correct, that's right.
So it's a strategy, but by world standards, it can't be the strategy. There's a ceiling effect that we're beginning to see. Now, the argument for Baltimore is, wait a minute, we haven't even been able to move to that ceiling because our charter laws are the most restrictive in the country, Maryland and Baltimore. But I just resist the idea that this is the silver bullet. There is evidence that at a very low standard of performance, it can raise performance. We shouldn't turn our back on that, but we shouldn't pretend that this is going to take us to moving that 7% figure to the 35% or 40% figure.
Ditto. I would just say I agree. And I do want to talk about collective bargaining agreements while I'm, So it could be the case that under certain circumstances, certain organizations, certain schools exit out. Okay. But if we accept the fact that in Maryland, it's always going to be some sort of collective bargaining unit, I think we need to make sure that as good partners that those agreements serve the purposes that they're supposed to serve. So if we look at two districts, DC and Baltimore, both have at least 5, if not 7 years of sort of the landmark teacher agreement. There are 2 landmark teacher agreements. It's always nice when you can do that. Another joke. Oh, I lost my train of thought. Oh, so you have, they're both doing the new collective bargaining, and it's based on pay for performance. Students or teachers are really able to sort of drive. Teachers are able to drive their pay, but it's supposed to translate into outcomes, and it's also it's supposed to allow us to recruit teachers who would not come to those districts and to retain them. And it's also supposed to set those teachers and staff members and principals, in Baltimore we have a principal's contract, who achieve those higher standards, we're supposed to push them to do more. I would say that I don't have a problem with either collective bargaining agreement. The question is, what do we need to do to improve them so that we get the outcomes that we want? And those are the kinds of conversations that we have to have, whether or not a charter school in Baltimore or another place is in or out. Either way, we have teachers who are sitting in front of students, and if there are contracts and agreements that form the relationship between the authorizer, the operator, and the teacher, then we need to make sure that those agreements are designed in a way that they create the right incentives, and we're not having that conversation. We just have to have them. And this is a perfect time to do it.
Laura, is PARCC taking an interest in the relationship between curriculum and results? I mean, can one imagine that in the future we'll be able to say something intelligent about this subject?
Well, we certainly hope so. That's the power of the data that will be coming soon, looking not just at aggregate results, but at the subscore in math and multiple subscores in ELA. So you can really look at how kids in each district are doing, how kids in each school are doing against certain criteria, and not just within your school and within your district, but across districts, across states. And that will be very, very powerful and will help. It will tell the cold, hard truth, but it will really help tell the story of what's happening so that it can be unpacked and you can really work with your teachers. Because I do think, going back to your original question, I agree with you that it is about curriculum and it is about teacher effectiveness. And if we don't do that right, we're not going to get it. As you know, I was on the board when the decision was made. Actually, in DC, they used to have 2 chartering authorities. Correct. And we moved intentionally away and we placed our bet on having one outside of the school system. And I do think it's made a difference. But I also agree that it hasn't made significant enough difference to push us into a different stratosphere on those results.
So let's talk about teachers. We'll get to questions, I promise. Just one more round on this issue. Professional development seems to be the graveyard of billions of dollars. It's our tax money, but much more importantly, it's our children. Why are we doing this so badly, and how can we do it better?
I have no idea what to answer that.
Okay. I'm sure there'll be thoughts in the audience.
So I'm curious about this. A report came out from TNTP recently called The Mirage, arguing essentially that, substantiating decades worth of experience saying that PD just doesn't work. It doesn't lead to any of the outcomes that we expect it ought to. But it relates back to this conversation, which is, I love assessments. I think they tell us a whole lot of stuff, but reading and math scores are not perfect proxies for all the stuff we care about in education. Now, I've never seen a great school with awful reading and math scores, but there are examples of some schools, especially for some reason inner city Catholic schools, often have middling reading scores, but they do something with the culture, with the way they teach reading, where kids are able to somehow persist in high school and then college better. My point here is that these test results are important. They tell a big part of the story. They don't tell the entire story, and it relates to PD. So just because PD cannot yet be correlated with academic outcomes in terms of reading and math scores, that's important, and we should stop spending $14 billion a year on it, or some number less than that. But I am curious if PD is doing stuff that we care about that we're not measuring yet. And for anyone, see, I see some heads nodding. As a parent of a young child who's in a school, I care about the test scores of my school. I care about other things that teachers are doing as well. And this is everything from emotional learning to, are they passing on the culture and values of the community? Are they teaching all these soft skills, grit, persistence? We don't have really good measures for any of that yet. So I want to concede that using our current dependent variables of reading and math scores, PD seems to be inefficient. I'm not convinced that it is the wasteland, because it could be doing other things we care about.
Hopeful. And let us open to questions. I have only one request, which I will be obnoxious in keeping, which is please ask a question. We've already had a lot of talking heads, and you're going to do better than we did. So a question, please. Let's start with, you had your hand up first. So, do we have a mic? Yeah. And please introduce yourself, if you would.
I'm Sheldon Kaplis from One Main Financial. I'm the Community Relations Director. We fund a number of these initiatives. You clearly have hit on the human capital issue, and yes, it's not a silver bullet just with charters alone, but the National Center for Teacher Quality has done some interesting studies with teacher prep, and we know that it isn't good. And yet, we don't, and who's doing the development? The schools of education who aren't training the teachers properly. So I guess my question is kind of twofold. One is, do we have the political will to finally say to higher ed, enough's enough? Because if you're not going to produce the teachers that are going to start moving the needle, we're not going to hire from you. I realize that that's not going to happen, nothing's going to happen overnight, but and my second second part is, I read the strategic plan of the Baltimore City Schools, and I know it's not been approved yet, the draft. There literally is about 1/4 of an inch on reading, and it's disgraceful. And where's the big bet? Because if you can't read, you can't do math.
Okay. I'll take the first question and then happily punt on the second one. I'll take the first one because both Dean Andrews, who would dearly like to have been here this evening and is actually doing the work you spoke of, the Dean of the School of Education here, and I have been part of something called Deans for Impact, a group of deans who really feel that ed schools are not anywhere close to what they should be. And that has a long history. Let me just say that this university in the 1880s found itself in that position with medical schools, and led a movement towards, with mistakes, of course, that we know about only too well, but led a movement towards evidence-based practice in medicine. We are at the very beginning of that in teacher preparation. Mostly the problem is that we are a want-to-be College of Arts and Sciences instead of a medical school. In other words, we're not a clinical practice yet. People forget that in the 1880s you taught doctors by lecturing at them. It was a revolution to put them in hospitals. We have residency programs now in Baltimore. We had them in New York. We're beginning to get serious about this work, but we have 1,400 schools of education, and about 20 of them are doing serious reform. So it's a very, very tough road ahead, but it's an urgent one. I couldn't agree with you more. I don't know if anyone wants to speak to the English curriculum. I mean,
No, the only thing I would say is that I think that I don't think there are any villains in public education, and I could be naive, but I actually don't think that there are. I do think that any teachers who come into Baltimore City want to do right by students and right by their families and work with their colleagues. I think that they're not entirely prepared. That they're not always entirely prepared, and I wonder whether or not the schools of education are looking at how to train teachers who want to do this particular work. Mm-hmm. So to train to go teach in Howard County or in St. Mary's County, where I grew up, is very different than to train to teach in Baltimore City. It's not that our expectations are different, but the students come with different stuff. And just would be curious to know if people are moving in that direction.
I mean, we've made teaching much more difficult to get into in New York State, which I did under Race to the Top. The one thing I couldn't do was make the profession more professional by giving real time to think. In Hong Kong, public school teachers spend 50% of their week planning with their colleagues. 50%. We have a few days of PD a year. The problem is this whole pipeline is broken at every stage. We can't simply raise the barriers to entry and then pretend that we're surprised when 30% fewer people apply to ed schools this year than did 3 years ago. This is a huge systemic problem.
Can I be a little bit of a contrarian here?
Please.
And this is more of a question than anything. We've spent the past 6 years nationally trying to overhaul teacher evaluation. Again, there was a study called the widget effect that came out that showed, like, jaw-droppingly that in urban district after urban district, and then in some big suburban districts, 99% of teachers were rated as effective when you had a binary rating, effective, ineffective. So Arnie Duncan and other great, good-hearted people said, we have to solve this problem. The problem is teacher evaluation. So because of Race to the Top, because of ESEA waivers, lots of states put a lot of time into updating their teacher evaluation systems, creating a 3 or 4 bucket evaluation, summative assessment, so ineffective, partially effective, up to highly effective, embedding student performance levels in that, a highly technocratic, highly sophisticated way of going about it. And in virtually every state that's implemented it, we still have the widget effect. In all of these places, we've spent 6 years and hundreds of millions of dollars creating new teacher evaluation systems that are still telling us, even though we have more categories, that virtually all of our teachers are effective or highly effective. You can look at the data from the Maryland State Department of Education. There are some districts that say they have 0 ineffective teachers. Zero. And only a couple of them say they have more than 1%. I don't know how we have a conversation about teacher preparation without having a conversation about how is it that those doing the observations, the ratings of our teachers, they're saying everything's cool. And a lot of families like the teachers that they have. So why is there a disconnect between the intelligentsia, our sense that we got to do something about this, and our evaluation systems, our administrators who are saying, no, 99% of our teachers are either excellent or at least effective in their jobs. That's the thing that we tried to solve from a policy point of view, and I'm looking back saying we spent lots of time, lots of energy, and got virtually nowhere.
But what's the alternative? I mean,
All right.
not that
next
that's a good
question.
answer.
Yeah. Go ahead. Introduce yourself.
Good evening. Thank you all for your remarks. My name is Bill Ferguson. I work for Dean Andrews here at the School of Education and also serve in the Maryland State Senate representing part of Baltimore City. We did see pretty dramatic progress from the late 50s until the late 70s. That progress really dropped in the mid-80s, and it largely came about with the end of forced busing. And so there was one reform technique around integration that really did see all boats rise. And it is not often a topic of conversation, be it voluntary integration, involuntary integration, but creating public schools where there is intentional diversity to teach 21st century learning skills. So interested in your perspective on
I'm sure we all have feelings on this one. Do you want to start?
I've spoken enough.
All right.
Well, I'll just talk about the experience I just had last week in New Orleans at a school that was dubbed Diversity by Design, with the goal of not just integrating, because there's a very savvy young principal there who said, this is not just about integration. Integration is important, but if that's all you do, that's not enough. It's not just about getting bodies in a building. It's about teaching empathy and understanding and creating a culture around that. And in schools where that is done intentionally, I think we're starting to see really good results, but those are a drop in the bucket because I don't think we think about that in schooling. And we don't have honest conversations about it. And that was one of the things I really got out of this school visit. You can tell I was very taken with this school, but that you have to have the hard conversations. You have to embed that in your curriculum and in your engagement with parents. Otherwise, you're just, again, integrating for the sake of integrating, but not actually changing cultures and mores.
My wonderful deputy commissioner in New York is going to be our next Secretary of Education, John King, and while he is in many ways deeply convinced of what might be called the Arne Duncan vision of education reform, the one place where he's already made it clear he wants to push much harder is on this very issue, racial integration. I think this is going to be an enormously difficult path to walk, and let me make this very clear. In New York City, one of the biggest charges against the charter schools is that they are racially making the worst city system in the country in terms of integration even less integrated. That is to say, the charter schools are unbelievably black and have almost no white students in them. When I came to this city as a newcomer a few months ago, I went to a public event, the first one I went to, discussion of charter schools, community event, and the most acerbic criticism of charter schools is that they were bringing in white students. They were going to privilege white students. I tell those two stories just to suggest that the instincts on this subject are so deeply divided and are so instinctual and so based in community history and community experience that any national movement is going to be extremely difficult to lead. And the data, which we all know, which does show, I think incontroversially, that less privileged students of color do very much better in integrated schools, all else being equal, which it often isn't. That data itself causes an enormous amount of controversy for all sorts of other reasons that have to do with community life and history and the country that we're in. So that's a long way of saying to your question, it's an incredibly important question. The next Secretary of Education is putting it front and center, but it's going to take enormous courage to move us forward after the experiences we have. Go ahead.
I don't need it.
You don't need it? All right.
Mr. Steiner,
Yeah, good.
I have to sort of push back on this whole integration point.
Go ahead. You might as well have it.
Okay, because, and I give you 2 points on it. My grandfather was one of the lead attorneys in the Brown case.
Right.
I'm originally from Washington, D.C. And Coleman, who was here, sort of oversampled the whole notion that blacks needed to be integrated in schools so that they can do better. I think if we're going to talk about integration, we need to move away from racial integration and talk about economic integration. That's the issue. If we look at White Plains, New York, in Westchester County, I don't know if many of you are familiar, but it's a very diverse community. In White Plains, New York, you have the choice of wherever you want to, even though it's a small district, you still have the choice of wherever you want to send your child to school. And the district does a wonderful job in sort of making sure the schools are balanced economically. And I think that's the conversation that we need to be having. And I think that's where the Supreme Court stated that we can do, because they had called White Plains up because they thought they were doing racially, but it's more economically. And how do we begin to take children out of these isolated economic situations that they're in? I mean, I truly think that families should be able to send their kids up to Roland Park to go to school. I really believe that. And Andy, I like your idea of bringing about a dramatic policy change, but why are we just talking about charters as one option? I believe that in urban schools we should have multiple options of providing education, and vouchers need to go back on the table for discussion.
Okay, thank you. We avoided that one. Quite seriously, we should actually have brought vouchers into the conversation.
So I agree. I am a zealot. It's hard to be more of a zealot, I think, on school choice than I am. I think that ultimately fixing schools and school systems it's about empowering low-income communities in a whole bunch of different ways. And I used to have a really quaint notion of our historical system of assigning kids to school based on where their parents live, this residential-based assignment system. I think this perpetuates inequality as much as anything. So I want to empower families to make choices over their schools so their kids can find the right schools, but also because I think that finally gives them power. White folks and affluent people exercise choice every day when it comes to their schools, either private schools or moving to the community that they care about deeply so they can match it up. Well, it's low-income families who don't get choice. So if we have to do it through vouchers or tax credits, great. If we do it through charters, great. To Senator Ferguson's point earlier, there's some cities that are experimenting with what we're generally calling common enrollment systems now, where as opposed to the default system being every kid goes to a school based on where his or her parents live, you have a system where kids rank their top schools, and essentially all schools or some subset of schools become schools of choice. And then there's a lottery and an algorithm that gets to decide where kids end up going, and there's a appeal process later on. But that is one way that you can take away the nexus between how rich you are and what school you go to. All this is great talking here, but Washington, D.C. is a really good counterexample to this and something we have to deal with. In Washington, D.C., in Northwest, as we call it, there are lots of families who pay $2 million for a home, largely because they know that their students will be assigned to a high-performing, largely white, largely affluent public school. Are we willing to have a conversation in urban areas about saying all public schools are now open to all kids on a lottery basis, meaning the families that paid $2 million for a house in a community where they thought their kids could get into a school because they had that money? Are we willing to take that away?
Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Charlie Duff. I totally agree with Senator Ferguson, and I agree, Lord knows, with you, Andy. But look at the demographics of Baltimore City, and whether you're trying to achieve racial integration or economic integration, you can't do it within Baltimore City. Now, if you can look at the entire Baltimore metropolitan area, you can probably do it. You can't do it within Baltimore City. So when you talk about political courage, I don't think you're just talking about political courage within Baltimore City. Are there examples of places in the United States that have recognized this and stepped up and dealt with it And the elected officials who did that, did they survive the next election?
A very quick cautionary tale. I wish it was a happier one. Memphis is often known as a place that's a center of reform in the Recovery District of Tennessee. When the city disbanded its own charter to make itself part of the larger county, very much along the lines you're speaking of, what did the larger county district do? It divided itself into 5 new districts so that it would not have to absorb the students. I thought having spent 6 years in Nashville, I thought I'd seen some sad examples of racism. I'd never seen racism until I was commissioner looking at Long Island. In Long Island, which has over 110 school districts, there are school districts where we are spending $9,000 a student and we can't bus anyone out because the districts around, which are spending $30,000 to $40,000 a student, won't take them. So these are incredibly fraught discussions that go to the nature of what we mean by our country and our community. Are we responsible for the child right next door, or the child 1 mile away, or 10 miles away, or 3,000 miles away? But you put your finger on a crucial problem. We'll get to you. Go ahead. Can you bring the mic?
My name's Jane Shipley, and I come from the world of science. So as I was listening to this presentation, I asked myself a few questions. And the first one was, I'm going to just ask myself these questions, but I want you to know how I got to the question I want to ask you. The first one was, how are your assessments validated? The second one was, what do they predict? I mean, after all, even the great SAT only maybe predicts how someone will do in the first semester of college. And then I asked myself, what's in it for the kids? The SAT, kids know there's something in it. What's in it for our students who are taking these tests? Then I asked myself, are you all assuming that our kids are doing the best they can? Because maybe they are equally not paying attention to it, because maybe they're bored stiff with these tests. Okay, I looked at one of them, one line myself. I'm an avid reader in more than one language. I do peer review for scientific journals, et cetera, and I was bored. Okay, and I'm just wondering if there's culture and climate in kindergarten that lets kindergarten kids do well by 3rd grade or 8th grade or 11th grade that has faded away. Why are we assuming, this is a question to you all, if I'm correct, that you are assuming that what these scores really, really show the truth in what our kids know, what are we basing that assumption on?
Good.
Well, I think those are great questions. And I think it's impossible to know what's in every child's head, but I want to step back from that question and talk about what is the test, what's the purpose of a test? The purpose of the test is, there are many purposes, and they're built around multiple drivers. So you talked about the prediction and the ability to predict. And in the case of PARCC, I can't speak for every assessment, but there's been a recent study that shows that the PARCC assessment is somewhat more predictive at the high school level than SAT. So that's good news. But if the only reason you're doing an assessment is to predict, you're missing a lot. And one of the things that we think is so important about PARCC is the signals that it sends. It sends signals about what teachers should teach in the classroom, about how the Common Core standards in this case what it actually looks to teach them well, what good student performance looks like, what student works look like. So there's a whole signaling effect of good assessment that signals instruction in the way you want and tells parents clearly what some of the goals are for their kids. So prediction is not the only piece. That said, the PARCC assessment serves as this credential. If you get a score of the 4 or 5 that I showed earlier, that is a ticket to entry into a credit-bearing course. Why does that matter? Because it immediately sends a message to a kid, what I do in high school matters. I'm not just sitting there and waiting to take my SAT and that'll get me into college. Actually, the work I do in my classroom is valuable. It's valued not just by my teachers here, but it's a ticket to entry into credit-bearing courses. So those 3 things, the value to a student, the signaling effect for parents and the teachers, and the predictive validity are all part of the way that at least the PARCC program was built.
We have time for 2 more questions. Yes.
So, my name is Erwin Hess. I'm a doctoral student here at the School of Ed. I come from the higher ed background, so this is all fascinating to me. My question for you, though, is basically how is it that Massachusetts, every time I kept looking up, I kept seeing Massachusetts at the top of everything. What is it that they're doing that we're not? And I remember in 2012, and I don't have any political sides, I remember when in 2012, Mitt Romney kept saying Massachusetts, #1 schools, #1 schools. And I remember on Twitter, O'Malley said, no, we have #1 schools, we have #1 schools. Maybe he was on to something, I don't know. But I keep seeing Massachusetts pop up. What are they doing that we can't?
It depends on who you ask. I think the consensus, maybe consensus is too strong a word, there is a plurality of people who say that for 20 years, Massachusetts had a stable number of governors and superintendents who believed in a set of reforms and they faithfully implemented them. And so this was, I think the Massachusetts Schools Act of 1993 or something, you can look this up, Google it, I'm probably wrong. It had a bunch of new funding, but it was the first true statewide accountability system that wasn't just reading and math scores, a bunch of other things, and then had accountability tied to that. So we were figuring out what's important in schools, measuring it, and then doing stuff associated with that. And you had governors who didn't politicize it, of different parties, and a long-term superintendent who faithfully did it. And so I think I'll speak for myself, that accountability, as we understand it, standards, assessments, interventions, curriculum, that framework got them quite far. It didn't get them as far as probably we would want to go, but that generation of accountability from the 80s until NCLB, Massachusetts, I feel got it right.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
Which was the transparency of exactly what Andy talked about. They were so transparent, they published their tests. Everybody knew what they were. It wasn't a black box.
Yeah.
And because of that, they could get real traction because everybody had a shared understanding of the goal.
I was a very, very, very junior member of John Silber's team in doing the MCAS, and I remember the struggles on 2 fronts. One, we put in the first serious teacher tests. Even today in most states, about 98% of test takers, these are teachers who want to be in schools, graduating out of ed schools, about 98% pass the praxis tests. In Massachusetts, in the first year we put in the new test, 50% failed. It's still, with New York, the toughest state in which to become a teacher. And I still believe that that's one crucial reason for the Massachusetts results. The other is the fact that MCAS wasn't just in English and math. We've created an apartheid of subject matter in this country, depending on how much the test counts. It's really bizarre. No other country in the world does it this way. We think English and math are up here. Science and social studies, well, maybe we test them occasionally, so they're there. And then foreign languages and the arts and phys ed and everything else you can think of is sort of third-class citizen. And in a few states, that's not true. In a few states. But why in this country we've decided that you can learn everything that really matters for annual yearly progress and everything else in English and math is completely beyond me. One more. No. The back.
I'm Jack Cannell, the operator of a school here in Baltimore and a charter school. I just have a question. It's just 2 very simple questions. Last question to ask is, when I saw the chart that Andy had and saw the chronic failure of Baltimore City school system, in any other context we would say, why is this happening and what dramatic thing must we do differently? So I thank Shanaysha for her comment, reflecting on her experience, a really, really candid conversation about that. But, what's the why for that, and what is the most dramatic thing we could do? And that goes to my second question. Would all 4 of you answer this question? If you could wave a magic wand to change the disastrous outcome for poor, low-income families and African-American and Latino children, what is that you would do? I heard some of it said, but I just want to hear from you what that magic wand is and the why behind Baltimore City.
Great last question. Terrific. I think you've in some ways given your answer.
Yeah, so I think based on what we've seen in the cities that I'm most excited about, It's a combination of things that like they have to go together. So one is, again, this is just my personal view, is that we have to stop seeing the district in urban areas as synonymous with public education. It is one delivery system, it is one operator, it doesn't need to even be the portfolio manager. We need to set up space for nonprofits to create an ecosystem of organizations that can be dynamic, that can create new schools, that can expand when they succeed. That stuff just never happened in the way that it needed to over the past half century in the district sector. So this governance system policy thing is essential, I would say. Number two is getting teacher credentialing, teacher certification, human capital right, and that is both a pipeline issue, but then also like a back end, having tenure rules, having certification rules that are meaningful. And then last is the accountability structure that sits on top of it. Are we measuring what counts in schools? And are we counting what actually matters the most? Are we holding schools accountable for that? Are we allowing great schools to expand and replicate? Are we phasing out schools that persistently fail their kids? So what I'm saying is nonprofit civil society sector that burgeons, that gets great entrepreneurs, an accountability system on top of it, and then human capital to fuel it.
Thanks. Laura?
I would echo everything Andy just said, nicely done. I would really focus on quality and on within the human capital space, the quality of what goes on in the classroom, effective pipelines of bringing quality people in. David talked about some mechanisms for doing that, but then really focusing on improving practice through very different structures than we currently have. The last thing I'd say is time in school. DCPS, the kids are in school maybe 6 hours. There's not a lot you can do when you take out time for assemblies and lunch and recess. The learning time, the actual learning time, and it's not just DC, it's across this country, and that has a lot to do with teacher contracts and structures that exist. We need kids in school more if they're going to learn.
So I like Andy's architecture, so I would say first when it comes to structures and ecosystem, I think he's precisely right that we need sort of, it's not a one-size-fits-all model that we want in terms of moving forward. Period. And I would say that we need to take a good hard look at what the central office is supposed to do, because it's probably the case that some form of a central office is never going to go away. Yes. I would suggest that we not take history and revise incrementally, but we take blue sky, let's not be limited by atmosphere, go to black sky and figure out what does the central office do in the 21st century given the needs of our students Absolutely. And being an ecosystem. And we need to have that serious conversation. Totally. The other thing I would say in terms of teacher quality, so tenure is a fascinating, and I come from higher education, so tenure is a fascinating subject. I would say that I think it's important to protect teachers and to give them some sort of insulation so they can do what they do well, but it's never forever. You can be the best teacher in 2015, but please know that in 2020, you have to show and prove, and everyone should go through a review. And the review is not to cut you down, but a review is to push you and to give you the incentive to continually improve your practice. So it's not that we remove tenure, but we rethink how it's done and how it's implemented. The third thing I will say just really quickly in terms of my magic wand, this is mushy, and if you know me well, I don't do mushy, but the social, emotional, and psychological health of our students is of grave concern. And that would be my magic wand. I don't have the answer, but we need people to get that together because it is affecting everything in our schools.
So I will be the contrarian to close. Okay. I'm sure all of these things are important, and I spent part of my professional life bringing them to New York State. But in the end, I think it's different. This country, because it's so wonderfully heterogeneous and brings folks from all over the world, cannot agree on a central narrative of what to teach. And so it has gone to this netherland of skills. I used to annoy teachers for a moment, and then we would all agree. I asked them to think for 30 seconds about the following problem. We're going to think critically together about nothing in particular. And that's what we're asking our students to do. We're asking them to think critically about nothing in particular. Our assessments are as good as they can be given the fact that we can't set texts, we can't set historical periods to study, we can't agree on what the war between the states is called. We are deeply embarrassed about teaching rich content, demanding high-level content to our students. And I'll close here, I had the great privilege for multiple summers with my wife, who's in the audience, of teaching Massachusetts public school high school teachers, regular public high school teachers, for a week on one or two texts. My wife did Bluest Eye, I did King Lear, and at the end of that week of 8 hours a day of drilling down into one text, these teachers with tears in their eyes said, I now remember why I went into teaching ELA. Until we can recover a passion and a courage to actually teach our students what we think is valuable, all the structural reform in the world will move us a few inches. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.